Welcome everyone. Now we are going to see the age of Johnson verse in this video. Come, let's go. The history of our later 18th century, as we have said, the history of struggle between old and new and of the general gradual term of the new. Okay, on the one hand, there were writers who followed the general practice of the school of Pope and aimed to produce the kind of verse which Pope had brought to perfection and made popular. In the works of these men, we recognize the continuance of what we may here call the Augustine tradition. On the other hand, there was a marked tendency among writers of the rising generation to abandon the practice of the school of Pope, which respond to a different range of influences and seek fresh subjects, fresh forms, and fresh modes of feeling and expression. So, in the works of these men, we may recognize the breaking up of the Augustine tradition. Okay, when in his essay on Pope, Joseph Warton took the ground that Pope was a great wit, but not a great poet, since his work lacked those imaginative and emotional qualities which are essential to true poetry. So these lines of reaction are sometimes independent of one another. Sometimes they run together and sometimes they cross. So and the resulting complexity is so great that to follow the history of our later 18th century poetry in detail would be impossible within the limits of a brief sketch like this. So a few matters of outstanding importance only can be here touched on. So, in the interests of simplicity, we will first deal with the continuance of the Augustine tradition. Then we will consider some aspects of the breaking up of that tradition. And finally, we will speak of a few individual poets whose work is sufficiently significant either on the personal or on the historical side to justify separate mention. Okay, so the continuance of the Augustine age. So emphasis must first be laid upon a point already noted that both Johnson and Goldsmith were strong conservatives in literary theory. In an epoch of change, they held fast to the immediate past. Johnson took it for granted, as Macaulay said, that the kind of poetry which flourished in his own time and which he had been accustomed to hear, praised from his childhood, was the best kind of poetry. And he not only upheld its claims by direct advocacy of its canons, but also consistently opposed every experiment in which, as in the ballad revival, he detected signs of revolt against it. Goldsmith was equally convinced that the writers of the Augustan age provided the true standard for future imitation. For him, in Mason's words, Pope was the limit of classic English literature. And at all important points, as in his aversion to blank verse, he showed himself fundamentally hostile to change. We shall thus be prepared to find that the creative work of both these writers is avowedly classical in matter and manner. Johnson's two chief poems, London and The Vanity of Human Wishes, it belong entirely to the preceding generation. Not indeed in their pessimistic tone, for that it is the expression of the poet's personal character, but in their dialecticism, their formal rhetorical style, and their adherence to the closed couplet. The same may be said of Goldsmith's two important poems, The Traveller and The Deserted Village. For these, as verified pamphlets on political economy, are scatteredly didactic. They are written in the closed couplet, of which they provide admirable examples, and they are often marred by the stilted and pompous phraseology, which was then deemed effective. Okay, their treatment of nature and rural life must also be noted. The poet, looking back at past experiences through a haze of memory, recalls what he has himself seen and known and writes of that. And though his landscape and his peasants are undoubtedly rather conventionalized, his descriptions have nonetheless an unmistakably personal quality. It is clear that, conservative as Goldsmith was, he yielded more than he realized to the influences at work about him. While as for Johnson, it is particularly instructive to remember that though he was incomparably the strongest individual force in the literary world of his time, he was still unable to check the encroachments of the new spirit which he abhorred. Okay, and then the growth of the love of nature in 18th century poetry. Okay, so the growth of a love of nature and a feeling for the picturesque is one of the most marked and interesting general features in the history of English poetry between Pope and Wordsworth. It is true that even in the thoroughly metropolitan literature of the Restoration period and the Age of Anne, we occasionally catch a breath of fresh air which seems to blow straight from the woods and fields. To say nothing of Milton and Marvell, who were survivors of the giant race before the flood, we must remember that Thomas Parnell and Lady Winchelsea, they show a genuine sense of natural beauty and the charms of rural life. In dealing with the poetry of the 15th century, we noted the fact that while the landscape of the English writers of that time was wholly bookish and conventional, that of the Scottish temporaries was often painted directly from reality and with great care and accuracy. And we ask the reader to bear this in mind, since we should presently learn that Scottish poets, they did much to bring the love of nature into later English literature. Alan Ramsay. So that it was in his writings that the reviving love of nature first became conspicuous. So Ramsay, he produced The Gentle Shepherd. It was a real pastoral poem, the characters in which are genuine shepherds and shepherdesses, and not the traditional shadows of a mere literary Arcadia. Okay, so but the stream which he here said flowing reached our London public and became an influence in our English literature through the works of another Scotsman whose name we have already mentioned, James Thomson. Okay, and then John Dyer. He was already appeared in connection with the reaction in form and whose descriptive Gronger Hill, a piece of vigorous landscape painting which owes much to Milton, but more to nature itself. It was published in the same year as Thomson's Winter. From this time on, the love of nature became increasingly prominent in our poetry. So we find it in William Gollins and William Blake, in Goldsmith, as we have said, we shall presently see in Gray, Burns, and Cowper. Okay, so the development of naturalism. So as the development of naturalism so conceived was due to the cooperation of many influences, literary and social. So its effects have to be looked for now in one direction and now in another. So they are in general so intimately bound up with other features of the new poetry that it would be impossible to isolate them for separate study. One or two points must, however, be indicated. So at this point, mention may be made of the work of William Blake, a mystic and a visionary whose apocalyptic effusions were inspired, as he himself declared, by the desire to restore the golden age, and who was also much influenced by the medieval revival. Blake might indeed find a place also among our early romantic poets, but I speak of him here because in that part of his poetry, which really concerns all readers in his poetical sketches, songs of innocence, and songs of experience, the love of the country, of simple life, of childhood and home, it marks him out as a leader in that naturalistic kind of poetry. The poetry of ordinary things, which Wordsworth was a little later to bring to perfection. Meanwhile, another and curiously contrasted phase of naturalism was being exemplified by Blake's contemporary George Graham, in whose works the village, the newspaper, the parish register, the broad tales in verse, and tales of the heart, it took the form of extreme and uncompromising realism. Okay, so even more important than this development of naturalism was the general revolt, which went on at the same time against the hard temper, the dry intellectuality, the hatred of the fantastic, the visionary, and the mystical. Okay, and then a name of extraordinary fascination in the history of the medieval revival is that of Thomas Chatterton, the marvelous boy. He was born at Bristol in 1752. We were now able to follow the actual process by which he conquered his Rowley. Okay, so a mystic and a visionary, apocalyptic effusions were inspired. So, this medieval revival was accompanied by a further spread of interest in the romantic past and especially by the opening up of the heroic and legendary world of the North, the world of Celtic antiquity. The ode on the popular superstitions of the highlands of Scotland, considered as the subject of poetry, which was written by William Collins as early as 1749. And then in 1760, a young Scotch schoolmaster, James Macpherson, he published a small volume of fragments of ancient poetry collected in the highlands of Scotland and translated from the Gaelic or Erse language. So these were offered as literal versions of genuine remains of ancient Scottish poetry. So, Robert Burns, he was endowed with marvelously spontaneous power of genius and an almost unrivaled gift of song. Okay, so the questions at issue cannot it be regarded as definitely settled, and it is still impossible to decide how much of the substance of the poems is really ancient and how much in them as they stand it is to be referred to the manipulation of the editor and compiler who undoubtedly treated his materials with a very free hand. Okay, so with this we are coming to the conclusion of this video. Hope you all have clear with all the points. So thank you for your patient listening.